Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of GeorgGreat. And before you ask, I actually had to put the lights directly in front of my face because I simply can't make myself visible during nighttime in any other manner. And yes, I actually have a reason to make this video exactly in the middle of the night. Because you see, today we are going to play a horror game. But not any horror game. We are not going to play any of the Silent Hills or Resident Evils, Fatal Frames or Parasite Eves. Those games are merely the leaves of the horrifying tree known as the survival horror genre. Nah, today we are going to take a look at the roots of this tree. We're going to experience the very heart, delve into the very origin of horror video games, my friends. Today we are going to play Alone in the Dark. Now, in order to make sure that we are all on the same page here, I want to give you some background information. Alone in the Dark was released in 1992 to universal critical acclaim, with the consensus being, this is pretty much the scariest game ever made. It was so scary, in fact, that often players would just shut the game off after being exposed to some in-game moments that managed to resonate with their personal fears. And if you still think I'm exaggerating, then here's this. When I told Seal that I was going to play Alone in the Dark, his direct response was,
George, if you are going to play Alone in the Dark, you can count me out. I remember this title as being the scariest game I've ever seen, and this is why I'm not willing to look at it ever again.
And then he left. I mean, can you believe that? The structure and design of this game were deemed so effective in inducing fear in its audience that for the next 15 years pretty much every successful, popular or otherwise notable horror game followed it to a T, using Alone in the Dark as a template for how to make a scary game. And if that's not enough, the game draws heavy inspiration from the works of H.P. Lovecraft, who is often considered to be the greatest horror writer that has ever lived. His theme of cosmic horror that emphasizes our insignificance as a species in the grand scheme of things proved to be one of the most effective with the audiences to this very day. Well, if you just happen to be afraid of dated graphics, then you certainly get a run for your money. But then again, this is a very old game, and it's notorious for being one of the most visually dated titles. I mean, half of the playable characters is so ugly that she is virtually unplayable. My god, I haven't even seen any of the monsters yet, but I'm already scared to my soul. So I don't think anyone would blame me for playing as Carnby. Actually, everyone plays as him when I think about it. I bet you've never even seen the girl character until just now. You're welcome. But then again, we should never judge a book by its cover. Simply because a game is visually displeasing doesn't mean that it's bad. Of course, I didn't even have enough time to figure out how to play this goddamn game, and now you throw an undefinable mess of pixels at me. Wonderful. Well, as the great man once said, Whew. Okay, now that we've escaped this nightmare of 3D art designer, we can finally figure out the controls. Okay, I got it. You have 6 buttons to operate with. 4 of them are used for movements, 1 to summon the menu screen, and the last one serves as the action button. The way your character moves can best be described with the phrase
10 controls, meaning that you can walk forward and backwards from the direction the character is facing with the up and down arrow keys, while the left and right buttons make him spin around in the corresponding directions. This makes the controls feel rather sluggish and uncomfortable, hindering your maneuverability with artificial restraints. Not only that, in order to use a gun, you need to enter a shooting mode, which leaves you stationary and vulnerable to attacks while you are aiming. Now, I ask you to appreciate the fine level of cruelty of this ludicrous design. You need to shoot a moving object, not from the perspective of an actual shooter, but from some remote point of view by trying to align the conjecturable vector of the gun barrel with the object moving on a three-dimensional plane, while your point of view is a two-dimensional monitor screen. If any of this sounds uncomfortable, well, that's because it is. It's massively uncomfortable, and even when you do get the hang of these controls, you are still hindered. The movements are slower than those of a game in which each directional button instantaneously moves your character in the corresponding direction, and the aim takes much more time than if you were to do it with a mouse. The result is, no matter how skilled at this game you are, you will never be as efficient as you would like, always operating with less finesse than you are capable of. These controls weaken you. If you were to objectively look at this mess of a control scheme, you would naturally consider it awful, as its very design is aimed at crippling the player. But this would be a completely wrong perspective, as the controls are above all a part of the game. And this particular game belongs to a particular genre known as the survival horror. You see, most video games somehow revolve around battles. You are constantly confronted by various enemies and, to put it bluntly, there are three possible types of confrontations. First type, you are stronger than your enemy. This leads to an action-heavy gameplay in which you have fun killing stuff and possibly living out your power fantasies. The emphasis here is on fun. The second type. You are equal to your opponent. This leads to a competitive gameplay in which the battles are challenging and they give you a sense of triumph when you win. The emphasis is on challenge. And finally, the third type. You are weaker than your opponent, which leads to the fear of your enemy, as confronting him would probably result in your demise. The emphasis is on fear. There are many reasons to be afraid, most of which are indirectly tied to being afraid of getting hurt or the fear of dying, and this last type of confrontation embodies the most primitive form of fear. This is the one you get when you're standing next to an angry bear or a madman with a gun. It is the basic fear of getting killed. Quite ironically, this most basic and universal kind of fear proves to be least effective when put in a work of fiction. The reason is very simple: the audiences are aware that what they see is not real, hence the phrase, "it's just a movie." Not only that, but they're just spectators. They are not the ones standing next to a bear, if you know what I mean. They are just looking at a man standing next to a bear, which makes it even less scary. And this is the fundamental problem with the horror genre as a whole. No matter what the creators try to achieve, it always remains an illusion. So in order to suspend the audience's disbelief, they use different tricks and try to make as convincing, believable an illusion as they can. They experiment with different types of horror. They search for different ways to involve the audiences on a personal level and to play on their fears and insecurities. And if done right, it works. The viewer or reader is tricked into feeling scared when there is no reason to be scared at all. But video games have an advantage. While in other mediums the audiences are always just spectators,
In video games, however, they are active participants.
I mean, they're still aware that what they see is not real, but it becomes much simpler to suspend their disbelief when the assumption is that it is actually them standing next to an angry bear. Even though it's not a real bear, it is no longer some other guy getting killed. It's the player.
What this means is that the most basic kind of fear, the third type of confrontation, which is almost impossible to make convincing in a movie or a book, becomes extremely effective in video games due to their interactivity.
The player is the one escaping the bear, not some guy on screen. And survival horror is built entirely around this type of confrontation, and it maximizes the formula by following two gameplay ideologies. A. Making the player feel vulnerable and weak, and B. Making the player afraid of dying. In order to make the player feel vulnerable, horror games implement limited controls. Hey, like the ones in Alone in the Dark. They are uncomfortable and difficult to use, they hinder your actions, and in doing so they prevent you from feeling overpowered, and your enemies from being unthreatening. Remember how difficult it is to fight in the original Silent Hill games. Now compare it to Homecoming, in which you play as a combat-trained marine with tons of different moves, who can do with a knife that regular people wouldn't be able to achieve with a bazooka. The grotesque monstrosities stood no chance, they were not as much threatening and scary as simply pitiful. And do you recall the vibe of the classic Resident Evils? Remember the tension of being overwhelmingly clunky while your enemies can jump around like acrobats? Even though you are technically stronger than anyone due to your arsenal, it feels as if you're weaker, therefore you feel vulnerable. As for how to induce the fear of dying in the player, the easiest way to achieve that is by making him lose his progress when he dies. It's usually done by allowing the player to save his progress only at specific locations which are far removed from each other, thus making him go through prolonged sections of gameplay without saving. In this case, if the player dies, he'll have to replay the game up to the moment at which he died. This is a rather crude but highly effective method. There are other ways, of course, but this is the most commonly used one, so let's leave it at that.
So what we have now is that the player is afraid of dying because he doesn't want to lose his progress, and he is constantly threatened by enemies that can kill him fairly easy, due to the lackluster limited control scheme.
This naturally results in at least creating tension in the player, maybe even fear in some instances. For example, when he stumbles into a very powerful enemy when he has no health left and the save point was half an hour ago.
But in order to make sure that all those mechanics have the desired effect, horror games use unnerving imagery and sounds.
The very fact that the in-game visualization of losing your character is him dying is what allows this gameplay to trigger the right associations in the player's mind and to shape the game into a horror experience. And that is the design of a horror game in a nutshell. By making you feel powerless through gameplay so much that you often have to escape your enemies. By making you lose something when you die, thus increasing the punishment for failure, and by complementing those mechanics with a scary or otherwise unnerving atmosphere, survival horror games make you feel afraid.
Now imagine that all this elaborate game design and the play on the player psychology, all this originated in Alone in the Dark. But this doesn't mean that the developers nailed this concept on the very first try, rather the opposite.
You see, there is a very fine line between making the player feeling vulnerable with limited maneuverability and making him irritated with broken controls. Alone in the Dark has this weird system in which in order to do any action you need to select it from the menu screen, which ties the chosen action to the spacebar. This is dumb. Look at this here situation. Out of nowhere, I am jump scared by an enemy. I currently have a non-combat oriented action tied to my spacebar, so I open up the menu, select the fight option, and then I start fighting the enemy. This is unnecessary, convoluted, and irritating. The game forces the player to stop, open up a menu, select the appropriate action, and only then continue, which unquestionably breaks the flow of the game. I mean, why not just have one context-sensitive use button and another one dedicated exclusively for fighting? Like, you know, any other game that has ever been made.
And there is another subtle detail which may seem nitpicky, but it actually has a great psychological effect on the player.
Let's backtrack a little. Remember when I opened the door and was suddenly attacked by an enemy? This was surprising. And since it is a horror game, scary. But then in order to defend myself, I need to open up a menu. You see what happens? For a moment I find escape from the scary situation. I hide within the menu. The selection of the fight command takes only a second, but within this second I find relief since I am safe here, secluded from the screen with the monster. This moment of relief breaks the tension of the scary situation, decreasing not only any possible fear you might have felt, but also the effect, the surprise of the jump scare.
And I get it. This is a rather small complaint, but believe me that this is just the tip of the iceberg.
What truly damages the game is that the fighting is easy. Once you get the hang of the clunky controls and actually confront the enemies you encounter, you realize that in order to win every fight, all you have to do is kick the enemies once they come close enough. Keep up the rhythm and there you go, you win. As we've established, the point of limited controls in a survival horror game is to make the player feel weak, to sustain the illusion of his vulnerability. And this illusion is completely gone when the battles are so simple. It only took me 3 encounters to master this combat system. 3! After that I felt like God, since none of the enemies posed any threat to me. This means that the scare factor got completely deflated, and the fearful third type of conflicts turned into the empowering, action-oriented one. And something tells me that no one would ever consider this a great action game.
But again, maybe even though the game failed at making the player feel invulnerable, maybe it succeeded in terms of making him afraid of dying. Nope.
You can save at any moment in this game, which means that you don't lose anything if you die, and therefore death is meaningless. This alone is enough to ruin a horror game, but in conjunction with the battle system that not only makes you feel as powerful as the Cthulhu himself, but soothes your fright with a moment of relief. It makes this game completely, 100% not scary.
And it must be addressed that not being scary is a pretty severe drawback to a horror game. That's why I think I'll take a little break now. I'll go look for Seal and try to bring him back here. Maybe later. You know, I'm starting to suspect that maybe Seal left not because he was afraid of the actual game, but because he was afraid of ruining his memories of Alone in the Dark that he remembers from 1992. The years were not kind to this game. But then again, it's not all bad.
I mean, for one thing, it's diverse. The amount of different mechanics and situations that the game will throw at you is enough to keep it interesting all by itself. Practically every room in the mansion is unique. And I mean very unique. You might open a door and stumble into a zombie's dinner party. You might see an unnerving ghost that kills you instantly if you touch him, and which forces you to carefully maneuver around him. Or you can encounter a freaking pirate, and in order to beat him you have to sword duel, which plays unlike any other fight in the entire game. And imagine that this level of variety is maintained throughout the whole game. It will throw a new enemy type or a new mechanic at you once, and it will never be used again. As a result, the experience becomes completely unpredictable. If Alone in the Dark was scary, this kind of unpredictability would result in creating tension in the player, since he would never know what kind of monstrosity will try to kill him next, or what kind of ordeal he'll have to go through in the very next room. But since we know that this game is anything but scary, it's not gonna happen.
But still, it's interesting to see what the game has in store for you, and this is exactly what will keep your interest alive while playing: the intrigue, the desire to know what unique event will happen next.
Speaking of intrigue, while traversing the game you will find different texts which will shed the light on the backstory of the game. I won't go into detail since, spoilers. So all I can say is that this backstory is simply fascinating. The events of which you can read within those texts span over several centuries of history, all of which are told from the perspectives of vastly different characters and which manage to justify the seemingly random encounters of this game, which I, quite frankly, didn't even consider possible. Those texts are narrated by voice actors, and the quality of their work can range from good to laughable.
I explored the caverns in a dream. The dark man came with me. Strangely, I felt almost well. How can I describe what I saw? No, what words are capable of explaining such evil?
As you can probably tell, those texts often delve into the occult. And this is where our buddy Lovecraft shows his influence, since the mythology of Alone in the Dark is pretty much completely based on his writings.
This led to the misconception that Alone in the Dark is the work of Lovecraftian horror, which it isn't, since the mere presence of Lovecraftian lore doesn't make up for a Lovecraftian story.
The thing about his stories is that they are not as much about the mythology with monsters like Cthulhu and Dagon, as they are about what this mythology implies. That in comparison to those creatures, we are nothing. Even the idea of confronting Cthulhu is laughable, since not only is the entire collective of our military strength is not enough to even remotely pose a threat to a being like that, but if any human being was to even look at him, this person would instantly and inevitably go insane. And imagine now that all this Lovecraftian mythology and cosmic supernatural horror are being incorporated in Alone in the Dark. And Edward Carnby kicks all their asses without even flinching. Let's make a checklist of what's exactly wrong here. Firstly, the supposed fear of Alone in the Dark comes not so much from understanding your insignificance in the grand scheme of things. In fact, it seems like Edward Carnby with his godlike kick would rate pretty high in the scheme. What's actually scary is the inability to escape the nightmarish situations that you found yourself in, aka you are trapped in this mansion. Secondly, the in-game imagery doesn't have the impression of the solid, definitive structure of the works of H.P. Lovecraft. Or in other words, the stuff that happens in this game just feels too random. And lastly, At no point in this game the sanity of the protagonist ever comes into question. He confronts creatures that defy reality, yet he is completely okay with it. Also, he does have this sort of shocked facial expression permanently glued to his face. Then again, it's probably because the graphics of this game suck.
So what we have is a story that manages to miss the point of works it inspires by to such a degree that it actually starts to remind me of a completely unrelated horror icon. The Twilight Zone.
I mean seriously, doesn't this sound like an episode of The Twilight Zone? That nightmarish, dreamy environment with unpredictable, seemingly random events waiting behind every door. A place that seems to operate by its own rules, which doesn't allow you to escape, and to top it off, without spoiling anything, I need to say that the ending of this game is as Twilight Zone-y as you can get without it being written by a Rod freaking Serling.
So let me get this straight. By pursuing the Lovecraftian horror theme, the developers unintentionally managed to capture the atmosphere of the Twilight Zone. What is actually impressive is how perfectly they managed to nail the said atmosphere, considering that they weren't actually going for it.
And I mean it works. The minimalistic, muddy visuals, along with the mystical soundtrack that breaks into disjointed melodies whenever you catch a glimpse of something not quite right. This presentation resonates with the slow-paced gameplay and creates this meditative, dreamy atmosphere as if you found yourself in a nightmare from which you can't wake up, which doesn't necessarily scare you, but which captivates you with its unpredictable events. Even the sluggish controls reinforce this atmosphere. Remember the feeling when you are in a dream and you try to run away from something or to throw a punch, but your muscles feel as if they are made out of wax? Or have you ever had to scream really loud, but no matter how hard you yell, all you can produce is a quiet sound of mumbling? This is exactly how the controls of Alone in the Dark feel. And it unquestionably would be a bad thing if it wasn't for this atmosphere, which manages to turn them into a part of a very unique gaming experience.
And this leads me to what is possibly the most important aspect of this game, which I've neglected up to this point. The puzzle solving.
The puzzles are esoteric, ambiguous. For example, in order to get past a group of ghosts, you need to give them some music to dance to, so that they would move out of your way. This type of puzzles is cryptic, since you can't possibly solve them with your basic common sense. And it's not a bad thing by any means, since, first of all, common sense puzzles are way too simple. The challenge is almost non-existent in a puzzle, the solution of which comes to you automatically. Like if, for example, this here puzzle could be solved by shooting those demons. There would be no challenge and as a result no satisfaction in solving this problem. But with esoteric puzzles, you really have to get into the right mindset to figure out the right solution. Secondly, such puzzles add to the mystical atmosphere of the occult. They bring this kind of mystic presence into the gameplay by forcing you to think in terms of the supernatural, otherworldly logic. They feel very authentic to this game, while puzzles operating on their everyday logic feel too mundane and, ironically, out of place.
But are they any good? They're nice actually. It still took me a couple of hours to figure out the solution to the very first puzzle, but after the solution came to me, I felt extremely clever. But what is truly interesting is not so much the puzzles themselves, but the way the game uses certain techniques in order to ensure that the player will have to legitimately solve these puzzles.
There are lots of items in this game, only a small portion of which is actually useful. This sort of makes the common method of using everything on everything extremely impractical, by putting a whole bunch of useless items in the game, and, just to drive the point home, limiting your inventory space, The developers force the players to think and actually figure out puzzles in order to progress. But that's not all. Remember the over-elaborate control scheme? The game implements the necessity of choosing the correct action in its puzzle solving. Basically, you can't just mindlessly use the item. You need to specify how exactly will you use it. And if you guess wrong, the game will force you to wait an arbitrary amount of time for an animation of the incorrect action to play out. And even though it seems horrible, it's actually a very clever game design trick. By punishing you for making mistakes, the game prevents you from mindlessly trying different combinations of items and actions until one of them eventually works. It makes you inclined to think of what might actually work in this particular situation, instead of mindlessly brute forcing your way through puzzles. And so we have esoteric inventory puzzles with overcomplicated controls and the inclusion of useless items. This is too much. Let me break it down for you. The puzzles that you need to solve are cryptic. There is no way of knowing what exactly the game wants you to do. But hey, you have lots of items in your possession, so you decide to try the ones that you think might work. But oops, you guessed wrong. Now you have to wait for the character to crouch, put down the item you used and stand up. If that's not bad enough, you have to pick up the item afterwards. Great fun, isn't it? Now repeat that for every item that could possibly be applied in this situation until you stumble upon the correct one.
This is what I call bad design. No matter how good at puzzles or simply tolerant you are, all you'll get from this gameplay is aggravation. Because the very aspects that make up its very design are inherently contradictory.
There are so many items to use, and with such ambiguous puzzle design, it obviously should allow the player to experiment. But the overcomplicated controls not only increase the amount of options, since every item has several use functions, but punishes you for guessing incorrectly. Which is lethal, since the player is now afraid to experiment due to the fear of an arbitrary punishment.
The overarching gameplay becomes way too difficult. Not only are the puzzles ambiguous, not only are there so many items to choose from, but the game also limits your ability to use them.
And I mean, any two of those three concepts would work perfectly together. But putting all three in the same game is just cruel. I mean, why would anyone put two gameplay mechanics that are supposed to raise the difficulty level on the puzzles that are already difficult to begin with? This conflicting mess of design choices results in a painful, excruciating puzzle solving, whose very structure is broken.
And it's not like puzzles themselves are impossible. They're actually quite decent. It's just that the game cripples the player to such a degree that he basically feels overwhelmed.
At the time of release, Alone in the Dark was a flawless masterpiece of horror. It was so scary that the players couldn't even force themselves to play it, which technically makes it the scariest game ever made. But now it's no longer scary, presentation is laughable and the gameplay feels incredibly rudimentary. However, it's not a bad game. It's a brilliantly structured piece with solid game design, good gameplay variety and great pacing, along with the immersive atmosphere and setting that has an elaborate and well-written backstory infused with the monumental Lovecraftian lore. With age, this game changed so fundamentally that it's practically a different game now. It's a Twilight Zone style nightmarish dreamy experience in a place devoid of all logic. So much in fact that you can't possibly predict what you'll encounter next.
This game is very flawed, but its flaws lie in little details, while the fundamental parts of this game work perfectly fine. This leads me to say that even though the game we are looking at right now It is a much lesser experience than the legendary Alone in the Dark of 1992. It is, nevertheless, a good game.
Some games age well, retaining their quality through generations. Some age poorly, seeming to wither and die, inducing no emotion other than nostalgia for their lost glory. But Alone in the Dark has undergone a metamorphosis. While losing everything it had in the flow of time, it replaced it with something new. For, like people, games can change and evolve with age. In the Twilight Zone.